Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Katz, a fellow in the International Security Program at CSIS and research director for our CSIS Technology and Intelligence Task Force. And I'm joined this morning by my colleague and fellow in the International Security Program, Lindsay Shepard, who leads our work at CSIS on emerging technologies and security applications, particularly on AI, machine learning, and defense innovation. And we're delighted to be joined this morning by Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, the director of the Department of Defense Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, or JAIC. General Shanahan came to the JAIC after a long, distinguished career in the United States Air Force and in defense intelligence, including serving as the director of Defense Intelligence Warfighter Support in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence before coming to the JAIC. So in lieu of any formal remarks or presentations, what we thought we would do this morning is have Lindsay and I curate a conversation with the general, exploring some of his lessons learned from his tenure as the director of the JAIC, and in particular, his assessment of how AI is really being integrated into the defense enterprise, as well as into and reshaping intelligence missions, both now and in the future. So before I turn the floor over to Lindsay and the general, just a few quick rules of the road for our audience here. We'll have this conversation with General Shanahan for about 30 to 40 minutes before turning it over to Q&A with you all, the audience. Please continue to submit questions through our event page on the CSIS website. And we're going to try to get through as many as possible, so please feel free to send them in, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you to General Jack Shanahan for being with us here this morning. The first director of the Joint Artificial Intelligence and concluding a long and distinguished career with the United States Air Force. So to open us up, General, we would love to hear a little bit about, for our audience, what is the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center and its the organization, and how did it get to where it is? And then we would love to hear a bit of a personal anecdote. What brought you to artificial intelligence and to this role?
Well, good morning to Lindsay and Brian both, and thank you for the opportunity to join you at CSIS this morning on one of my final fireside chats on the way out the door after almost 36 years in the Air Force. But you asked two parts of a fairly detailed question that I'll try to cut to the chase on both of them. In terms of how I got to this point, it's not a linear journey, and maybe there's a little bit of a unicorn aspect of how I ended up in this position. In a very traditional role in the Air Force, I spent the first 15 years of my career flying, and started off in the F-4s and then end up in the F-15E Strike Eagle. And at some point, I figure I have a title for a book, From Phantoms to AI, the journey of one officer's career in the United States Air Force. It's a long time ago, it seems, F4, dating myself a little there. But for the second half of my career, it was a very varied set of experiences. I commanded an intelligence group, non-traditional for an aviator, command and control wing, the 55th Wing at Offutt, and ISR wing, OSD policy on the staff, on the Joint Staff, J39, the Deputy Director of Global Operations, and the U.S. Warfighter Support, and the Air Force IR in San Antonio, a pretty substantial transformation into becoming the Air Force, unknown Air Force, just into a second transformation within the last year. What that means is a variety of different experiences that actually set me up. I couldn't have asked for a better setup for, first of all, starting Project Maven, which I never could have expected in a million years. And then from there into being the director of the Joint AI Center, or the JAIC. Unpredictable in every aspect, but in my role in USDI and Warfighter Support, we were chartered with taking on the job of trying to figure out how could you automate, accelerate, and augment the exploitation of full motion video coming off of various ISR platforms and sensors. That was the beginning of Project Maven, driven at the time by Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, as I say, in many settings before, patron saint of algorithmic warfare. And his label for us was the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, aka Project Maven, which is much easier to say, but really doesn't get to the heart of what we were trying to do, which is a future of algorithmic warfare, algorithm against algorithm, in a fight of the future. And after doing that for about a year and a half, the intent, Bob Work's intent, was never to make this about intelligence and only about intelligence. It's just we had the one place that we're chartered to go figure out how to get AI fielded faster and do it at scale. And as they looked around and decided what could we put together for the Department of Defense to go across the entire spectrum of the department's missions. They needed something to stand up. We went through a lot of different options and course of action analysis, as they say, and settled on a joint AI center. And at the time, as sorry as I am to say this, I was the only senior leader that had any experience fielding AI programs. Not talking research and development. I'll get into that here in just a second to explain the JAIC's mission. And as a three-star, I understood the way the building works, the processes, the politics, all the hard parts that require to get an organization built from nothing and turning into what we're expecting in the very near future to be a very high-performing organization. It's a journey that is not easy to achieve in the Department of Defense. And as I say, at this point, I am the only DoD senior official who has experience in leading not one but two DoD field organizations, RD organizations. And say that in no way as I said the other day on a different conference, I don't say that as that's a low man. That's a state of affairs that needs to be corrected as we build a new generation of leaders that are in a position to be much better technical experts than I would ever consider myself to be, but also understand how to run big organizations and make them high performing. Which gets me to the point of what is this? It's not an R&D organization. It is designed to scale AI and its impact across the Department of Defense, accelerate adoption and integration of AI. It is the classic conundrum in the department of we have the world's best R&D in AI and have so for 50 years with DARPA at a leading role back in the 50s on this. In fact, what DARPA did has generated what we know as Silicon Valley AI experience today. But it took us a while to understand what it would take to go across the technology valley of death, the chasm, as I like to talk about. And there's a lot of reasons for that chasm. A large part of it is all this commercial tech right now is not built for DoD, and it's out there available, but we haven't had a way of bringing it in and getting it fielded and doing it scale and doing it very rapidly. So that is the mission of the JAIC, is adoption and integration of AI across fielding organizations in every possible part of the department, from the back office to the battlefield, from outer space to undersea to cyberspace, and all domains and points in between. So it's a daunting mission in many ways, but it's one I'm incredibly proud to have been asked to stand up because it's part of a strategic competition, a global strategic competition, an economic competition, a national security competition. And the vision of the JAIC is bold, like any vision statement is supposed to transform the Department of Defense through AI and do it with boldness and alacrity. Big vision. How do we get there? Well, that's a separate question. We'll probably talk through some of the aspects of what that means and how we're going about that in the JAIC as we're in this now just about coming close on 2 years from official stand-up, but 18 months since I took the seat.
Great, sir. So as you mentioned, the JAIC has many priorities as well as mission areas, and your organization highlights 6 in particular as core missions: predictive maintenance, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, cyber, joint warfighting, intelligence business automation, and warfighter health. But within those issues, what would you say are the front burner ones on a day-to-day basis right now, the core missions that take up most of your and your leadership's time? And do you see those priorities changing in any way in the coming years?
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer that question in a slightly different manner than you might expect. And what I thought I'd do is take it through the organizational chart of the JAIC and talk about our priorities in sort of each of the areas that, of course, will include missions, but not exclusively about missions. Why do I say that, and why do I want to do it that way? The value of the JAIC in an organization whose sort of core component is this idea of centralized direction, common foundation, and decentralized development experimentation. Why centralized direction? Because the lessons learned of every industry, academic community in starting an AI project and trying to bring it to scale requires a centralized direction of some type. There's always a question of why do we need something at the OSD level to drive sort of transformation across the department. The centralized direction is so important to this, or else everybody's going to go out and do their own thing. It's just sort of what has happened in the department, not just in AI, but particularly in AI over the past 20 years has been that sort of stovepipe effect, and just why you haven't had the acceleration that we're all looking for to drive that kind of change in fielding AI. So we put together a centralized direction component of the JAIC, and within that, it's not just product delivery. It's not just the mission side of the house. It's all other aspects of artificial intelligence fielding pipeline, as I like to call it. And what I learned about in Project Maven, the lessons are voluminous and sort of what I took away from Maven. But one of the most important ones is a great appreciation for what the AI fielding pipeline looks like, which is not going to be different than what commercial industry or a medical hospital, anybody would look at if they were trying to do AI at scale. And there's a lot of components to it. So what we've built into the JAIC is sort of a chief of staff function, right? So when I say the priorities of the chief of staff or what you would expect of a chief of staff, we've just gone through a pretty major realignment in the JAIC. We'll go JAIC 1.0 to 2.0, and I can explain that if you're interested in talking about why we did that or components of that organization or realignment, but also policy, budget, or programming budget and acquisition. Boy, there's so much going on now. We're trying to close fiscal 20, all preparing for what is the year 21 spending. As you know, in the department, we spend a lot of time on obligation rates, execution rates, getting things on contract, expediting, sort of bringing things to actually field AI-enabled capabilities. So we're going through that entire process of finishing up the current fiscal year budget, building the detailed spend plan, which is not easy to do. We're talking about emerging tech. And so there's a tendency to be held accountable for what is the dollar level of detail in fiscal year 23, for instance, on the JAIC. Very hard for me to judge where technology will be in 6 months, never mind 3 years down the road. So it's a balancing act where we have to predict what sort of technologies we'll be bringing into the organization while satisfying those who want to see details on a budget plan. It's a little bit of a dilemma for us. And I think anybody who's in the emerging tech business would have the same problems inside the government or outside the government. So we're looking for sort of a little relief from the standard ways of looking at expenditure rates or obligation rates, RDT&E versus O&M versus procurement. So trying to make this almost a colorless approach to doing it. So that part of the JAIC is really focused on that aspect, while also building for future budgets across the entire organization. And it's equally challenging to do this as our priorities do change based on the customer requirements. The military services and the combatant commands, our primary customers. We're not driving the requirements in the JAIC. We're working with those customers to figure out what the requirements should be and building to sort of what we call their specifications. We have a whole process through which we go to sort of prioritize what those requirements are, and a whole litany of areas that we would look at very closely before making a decision on what to embark on. And then as part of strategy and policy, it is a variety of important areas. So the priorities are responsible use of AI. So our AI ethics lead, who's working on how do we bring the AI ethics principles, which Secretary Esper signed out, and make that part of every single future project we do. Taking into account on the beginning of the contracting side of it, our first contract in a joint warfighting, there was language, which is not my language, but still important language about how do you plan to account for ethics principles as a delivery capability. So it's interesting feedback from on how they would, but also international engagement. And that's the big component is we've had over 7 different, a variety of different partners and countries and allies across the globe, trying to figure out opportunities for us to partner. In some cases, an alliance like NATO, worked a little bit with the European Union, trying to figure out where they're going with it. So lots going on in the strategy and policy. And we'll come back to, I think, one of your questions on sort of the AI talent management piece of it. One of the cornerstone projects for us over the next year will be responding to a congressional direction on something called Section 256, which is for the department to come back with an AI education and training strategy and implementation plan. Big task, very important for the department, and that part of the strategy and policy team. On the Joint Common Foundation, some of you are familiar with Bill here, which was will be this AI, ML, DevSecOps environment built on an enterprise cloud foundation. Probably talk more about that in terms of where we stand with JEDI as that enterprise cloud for DoD. Test and evaluation, validation, verification, and adversarial AI. Those are all kind of sort of priorities. And then that brings us to sort of the core of products and mission. And one of the key aspects of our reorganization was to separate what had all been under sort of missions and break it out between missions and products. One, we didn't have enough people to do it any other way at the very beginning. But then as Nan Mulchandani, our chief technology officer with over 26 years of Silicon Valley experience in the commercial software business, came in, looked around and said, there is a much better way, an effective and efficient way to organize ourselves. And that is to take the mission side, put all our or most of our uniform people into the mission side. Their focus would be on customer engagement, sitting down with the services, sitting down with the combatant commands and task forces, understand what their real user requirements were. Those user requirements would be continued to be developed and hand over to our products team. The product team is a very commercial looking, sounding, smelling part of the JAIC where you're focused on product development. It's a tech piece of this. It's getting the contracting aspects working and moving quickly. And then products and mission are working very closely together. This is what we would call product development. We didn't have anybody who really understood product development when we first started it during in June of 2018. Thanks to a lot of help from people on the outside who do this for a living, and especially non-Johnny as CTO. We have a much greater understanding of what it takes to get the up and running, and then constant user feedback and integration, all those other components of it. So in the mission side itself, you mentioned some of the projects we're working on. They're all priorities, but if I were to point to over the course of the next year, where my focus has been and will be for my replacement when that individual is confirmed and in the seat, is on joint warfighting operations. And we started with predictive maintenance, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, some elements of defensive cyber for very strong reasons. One, we didn't have a lot of capacity. We had to learn again. I knew what the pipeline looked like coming from Maven. I had a few people, almost nobody else in the organization until we got our chief scientist in, and this is what she did both in government, in IARPA, and then in a startup organization. She understood very well what fielding needed to look like. So until we got that really moving, we had to go with sort of building muscle memory, building repetitions. That included lower risk, lower consequence missions. Predictive maintenance, HADR, and sort of the smaller parts of defensive cyber were these lower consequence, lower risk missions. Once we felt comfortable building those out and getting ready to transition some of those capabilities. So we're not going to do these ad infinitum. We're going to hand these capabilities off to somebody else over a course of a 5-year cycle. Then we turn to warfighter health, which has got so much potential in it. I'm so proud of the warfighter health team. One, on COVID-19, sort of how they jumped to the forefront. We can talk more about our response efforts to that. But two, it's led by a Navy 06 who happens to be an active cardiothoracic surgeon who wrote his War College paper on how AI and ML will revolutionize. He didn't say transform, he said revolutionize military medicine. So he's the right person to lead that one. And then now into this big one called joint warfighting operations. And that is going to be everything that you would expect it to be. We'll start with, again, smaller use cases to learn what right looks like. We're not jumping straight to AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems. Very complex, a lot of questions on policy, ethics, and lawful use. Start with state mundane, nothing's mundane, DoD, all hard. Data, the talent, the culture piece of this, and then management. So the priority for this one is ability on the mission side, 4 or 5 operations over the next couple of years. But I just wanted to give an overview. There's a lot more going on in the JAIC that cover much more than quote unquote just the mission side.
Fantastic, sir. And so within joint warfighting operations, of course, a critical part of warfighting is intelligence. So as you know, at CSIS, we have a task force looking at the intersection of emerging technologies and intelligence. So we're hoping maybe if we could dive a little bit further, if only briefly, into really reflecting on your experience with Project Maven and at the JAIC now, how you've seen AI and machine learning augment or enhance intel missions, particularly ISR. What would you point to as sort of key successes, as well as maybe challenges of integrating these technologies and tools into ISR going forward?
Yeah, and in so many ways, you might look at the Intel community, the Intel enterprise, as the best places for introducing AI, machine learning, natural language processing, less so probably on things like reinforcement learning. Why? It's so data driven. Everything about intel and analysis is data driven. And the world has changed in a way that more open source information is available than ever before. Just look at Twitter or any social media feed. There's gems in there. You know, I call data. People say, well, data is the oil of AI. That's a very bad phrase. I say it's maybe mineral ore, right? You've got to get a lot of bad stuff out of the way to find the nuggets that are inside that big piece of rock. But there's gold in them. There are hills. And how do you mine that gold? How do you bring it together in all these different sources of data and information coming from every possible classification level, from special access programs down to purely unclassified social media? It's a conundrum the department has faced, or the intel community has faced for decades, but it's brought home. And if anything, COVID-19 is a watershed moment. We always talked about this overload of data, but it has just brought it home how much data is available, but how little is being done with it in terms of predictive analytics. So when we started on Journey Project, it was a very specific, full motion video from remotely piloted air, because there are forces and army thousands of intel analysts hide up looking at screens for 12 hours at a time. And if you've been to one of the Air Force big analytic nodes, and there are people on this call that have had those positions in those nodes. It's mind-numbing work at times. It's critical work. You can't take your eyes off the screen, literally, in some cases, because something is happening on a battlefield. And yet, 8 hours will be mind-numbing boredom and energy drinks and everything else sitting by their side. It's really tough work. We have to get better at that. And we made our pitch on this back in the earliest days, the Defense Innovation Board. And I sort of boasted about how much video we took in every day. So an NFL season worth in every single day. And I'll never forget that Eric Schmidt, chairing the DIB, said, "What are you kidding me? How much you think YouTube takes in every day?" He says, "That's nothing what you're doing in DoD." It was a wake-up call that we thought we sort of owned the planet and it was the biggest problem in the world and nobody could solve it. He says, "We've solved this. We know what this looks like in the commercial world." And so we embarked on that and went to both DoD sources, but a lot more to commercial because they had computer vision capabilities ready to go. So our focus initially was on computer vision capabilities and looking at a very small ontology to begin with, the vehicle classes, or just vehicles, people, vehicles, building, and then sort of you add more sub classes to the ontology over time. And it proved so useful to learn just what this was and was not. We fielded the first capabilities in 6 months after standing up the organization. We had 4 startups on contract in less than 3 months, unheard of in some ways in the department, taking lessons learned from places like Defense Innovation Unit, very useful. They had been through this journey, not necessarily fully on AI, but just sort of in tech in general, and DDS and some other organizations did it. The more we learned, the better we got at it, and we could start actually fielding algorithm updates faster and faster. So it's proved to be very successful in so many aspects of just showing the world what is in the art of the possible. I always advocate for the idea of minimal viable product out to the field and be with the user from the beginning, telling them what's coming. We all have the scars of experience for some shiny toy showing 5 years into some block upgrade, no understanding how it worked, terrible UI, nothing about it was made for the user was getting 50 to 60% MVP. You understand it? You understand it. It was a first because bring it on. We'll tear it apart. We'll be very critical when we need to be critical. We'll praise you sparingly when we need to, and the capability will continue to get better. And so they've learned and learned and learned, and now people in the field begin at least to taste what AI was, or as I like to say, more importantly, what it is not, and is not killer robots right now. Very kind of fragile and brittle capabilities were being fielded, but at least they saw it. Otherwise, it's science fiction to so many people. And there are people out there at the sort of mid-level enlisted and mid-level officers and civilian equivalents that have been thirsting for the capabilities, been screaming for it. Just put something in our hands and we'll make it better. And that's what has sort of accelerated is about 12 different lines of effort that are currently underway, moved from just the medium altitude RPAs to the high altitude ISR platforms and sensors. They're working very closely with Special Operations Command on some publicly available information, captured any material, a bunch of different ones. I won't go on too long on that, but that's sort of where we came. So there's great strengths in this. But the one thing I want to emphasize, and I'll turn it back over to you, is it turns out that as you offer these capabilities that Maven has to the field, the Intel analysts are using them, still not as much as I think that the technology proves they will be able to next couple of years. But now the special operators who said, well, we've never seen this kind of capability before. So the operators are overtaking the Intel analysts in terms of they never had any bad habit patterns to break. They just went straight to the technology and figured out how to use it in a different way. It's a little bit of a classic technology thing, right? You just put it in the hands of an operator and they're going to figure out how to use it in ways you never intended. We will never claim to know what right looks like from our end. We'll give the technology capability. Somebody else will turn that into an operating concept and some innovative ways of using it. So enough for that, and back over to you.
Well, thank you, sir. And I think this is an appropriate time to turn to, anytime we have a conversation on artificial intelligence, the underlying thread and often one of the biggest topics is people, which I think is very appropriate that when we talk about artificial intelligence, it's really a conversation about human intelligence. You mentioned in your opening remarks congressional action on providing authorities and mechanisms for the department to get the right talent. We also know, your service, the Air Force, had piloted the Computer Language Initiative to treat computer language competency equivalent to foreign language. So we'd really love to hear you talk a little bit about, where does the department need to go moving forward, the JAIC and the services more broadly, on getting the right talent in the door. But I think almost as importantly, or perhaps more importantly, how do we place that talent, and then how do we retain it? How do we keep it once it gets into the department?
Yeah, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to say it again because the importance of four core challenges of anybody trying to bring AI at scale and field it. It's data, culture, talent, and product management. So the talent piece of this, it's core to doing this right. And as we stood up, as you can imagine, the challenges of standing up a brand new organization chartered to bring AI to scale at the department, and we didn't have AI experience to bring in. So in the first year, we didn't have many people that really understood what this looked like. Why? Because there was a dearth of talent on AI across the services. If they were out there, they were in the research and development side, and they weren't made available to the JAIC because we had 6-month detailees to begin with. Then we sort of brought in another round of detailees for a year. Normally, if you're going to start up a sort of a tech organization in Silicon Valley or somewhere like it, you wouldn't do it that way. You'd start with a core element, sort of by name request, real expertise, and then build the organization out. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for that to happen. So we brought in people as quick as we could, and then we're focused on a couple of different things. First of all, upskilling our own force. So whether it's brain camps, in-house training, bringing in thought leaders from across industry and academia on AI. There's a big upskilling element just within our internal workforce. At the same time, we're focused on what does talent management need to look like for the entire department. I mentioned Section 256 of NDAA 2020. One of the sponsors that are kind of drives that, Representative Rick Larson in Washington State, is passionate about making sure the department gets to the point everybody understands what AI is not. This is an education, it's training issue. It's the senior most leaders from 4 and recruiters down to our newest recruits coming in that have some introduction to emerging tech and AI and coding skills in their initial training courses of any service at any level. And so it's a top down and it's a bottom up, and it all needs to happen simultaneously. To say that is a formidable task would be a gross understatement. But the thing about 256, it's forcing us to look at this as a Department of Defense. While we're being tasked to lead that, we're not going to be the only people doing it. We could never possibly do it in isolation. This will involve every single military service. We're talking with the combatant commands. We're talking with all the OSD undersecretary components, because this involves everybody. And there's a tendency when you bring in something new is to feel like zero sum. Well, if I add AI into my professional education bucket, something else has to come out. We were just told to focus on China, so we need to focus on China. Well, guess what? AI and China are kind of inextricably related. So why don't you do both? You can talk emerging tech and China in the same one. So we are building through what this 256 needs to look like, but it goes well beyond 256. It's just what every service is trying to do as a service, we want to bring together in a united front to help the services with sort of responsibilities at the OSD level. One of the things we will advocate for when we've grown a little bit bigger and have more capacity is this thing called OSD Functional Community Manager for AI. Think of how cyber grew up. It required a centralized element to help people with everything from pay to recruiting to retention. And then, Lindsay, these are things you're asking about. How do we not just bring them in, but how do we then retain them and promote them? All of those are aspects of this that we're addressing as part of the JAIC. I'll tell you, the services had to put some slides together before my last update to the Secretary of Defense on this very subject of talent management. I was incredibly impressed by how much work had happened since just 6 months ago by the services. They all understand the nature of the problem they face. They understand in general terms some ideas about solutions. What we need to do is help them not just do it by service, but do it as a Department of Defense. We have just some limited authority, right, to bring people the higher pay level. We've asked for additional authority in year 20 to do more broadly across the department. We don't believe we will do that in 21. We'll approach it again in fiscal year 22. But we're coming up with all these creative ways. Like one of our best recruiting sites right now is not USA Jobs, shocking as it will be for some people to hear that, but it's our LinkedIn, it's our AI.mil Twitter feed or our Facebook page. But we're getting people to come in from different mechanisms. But for the JAIC itself, as the saying goes, A players attract a talent. So non-Mulchandani brings in additional people. We have somebody else showing up in the next month. It's going to be a superstar data scientist, PhD, I believe from Harvard or MIT. You get that momentum building, so you start bringing more and more of those people in the door. We can't expect them to have that level of expertise yet, but we'll build this over time. And then what we have to do with things like, I know the Air Force, Navy, Army, Marines are all looking at different ways of skill identifiers, tracking people throughout their career, giving them an incentive pay. The Air Force, as you were alluding to, is looking at ways, I believe it's already implemented. Mike Kanan, who's on the call today, was the driver behind this, is pay them money for coding skills like you pay your linguist for language skills. A simple yet unbelievably powerful idea that should be duplicated everywhere. So we've got to work our way through that. And this requires us working closely with the Congress, because some of these will require different legislative authorities. There's an awful lot we're taking on with this one, but it's also not going to happen overnight. This is going to be a journey of 5 to 10 years to really begin to change the fabric of that population in the department. Over.
Great, thank you, sir. Maybe ask one last question here from Lindsay and I, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Department of Defense earlier this year adopted the ethical principles for AI put forward by the Defense Innovation Board. Those 5 ethical principles for AI are for it to be responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. What do these principles mean and look like in practice? How they apply to the key missions and priorities you've been describing throughout? And if you have time, I'd be interested in particular on Intel and ISR. What does ethics and intelligence look like in practical terms?
The last part of what you said, I'll come back to that to make sure I understood the very last part. It was just chopped up a little bit, but I understood the first part very well. And it is a central question, right? There are a lot of companies have put out some version of AI ethics principles. The big question is, they're words on a paper until somebody figures out what to do with those principles. I'm proud of the team that we've put together. I hired someone in to lead this ethics implementation piece, and she's up and running. She's got this responsible hands of AI governance. We were in close cooperation and partnership with the Defense Innovation Board over the 15 months that they took to recommend AI ethics principles. And then once they recommend to the department, we recommend to the secretary to adopt those principles with slight modifications that were more DOT focused. And now we're figuring out what it takes to actually implement them. We've had a small team that we have been out on the West Coast talking to companies everybody on this call would recognize very well, biggest companies in the United States and in the world. And they're all struggling a little bit is how do we get to the implementation phase of this? So what we're doing is looking at every part of the AI fielding pipeline. from development all the way to integration, and of course, employment or use, which the more we get towards more autonomous systems, and especially AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems, serious questions that have to be addressed and answered about the safe, lawful, and ethical use of artificial intelligence. But I feel comfortable that we've got a head start, so much so that I believe we'll set the standard, not only for the United States government, but in some ways for the entire nation and internationally, because our emphasis on getting this right in terms of implementation. And give you a couple of just short examples here. First of all, in our contract language, or at least the request for proposal on the Joint Warfighting task order under the GSA contract vehicle, we put in there, we asked people to come back and tell us how you would take into account sort of these AI ethics principles. Each one of them has different meaning. Each of the five is very different. Responsibility is all about accountability. Something goes wrong on the battlefield, who will be held accountable for that. So they're all different elements. We want to hear from the vendors how they're going to do it. It's the same as work through our different projects. We're building all our data cards. We come up with ourselves. We learn the best in the industry. Companies that have been doing this for several years. That's a good start, is to understand what the data provenance is, or any potential bias in the system because of the skewed data sources that you're using, all the way up into test and evaluation. I always point to T&E and validation and verification as one of the ways we will be adhering to the AI ethics principles, especially in terms of reliability and knowing what is being fielded. And there is always an element of AI that you don't quite know what happens when you field a machine learning or reinforcement learning system. I grant that, but we're not quite at that level in the department right now. I don't think anybody is. That the primary problem we're facing. So we're focusing a lot on T&E and V&V. And then there's something that some of you are familiar with already, DoD Directive 3000.09, Autonomy and Weapon Systems. That was built in a pre-AI time, but it's still useful right now as a guide as we look to, say, joint warfighting and put AI-enabled capabilities on a platform at the edge that eventually could have weapons employment as part of its employment overall operating concept. How do we work our way through 3000.09? What do we need to consider in terms of the employment part of this that is in accordance with the law of war, the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law? These are all things we're taking into account each and every day and building up a core group of people across the services and components that are in with this on this Responsible Champions of AI committee. Now, I will also say, and some people get a little concerned on one side about DoD's use of AI. Some people feel like, oh, this is going to hold you back too much. You're the Department of War. You have to consider employing weapons. It doesn't slow us down right now. What we're doing is doing this all in parallel, simultaneously. At some point, could we pause long enough to have to work our way through a use case of 3000.09? Sure, I believe that will happen. But at this point, we're nowhere close to saying that all stop, can't go any further until we get this. It's all happening simultaneously. And if we repeat things, something about ISR and yeah.
Well, fantastic, sir. I think now it might make sense to jump right into the Q&A with the audience. Everyone, you continue to submit questions. We do have a fantastic list of many already that we're going to try to get through here with the general. But the first one here, I imagine an issue on many people's minds. Yasmin Tajda from the National Defense Magazine asks, how is COVID-19 affecting the work of the JAIC? Have any key issues been affected?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. You were cut out for the first half, but I heard COVID-19, so I believe that's the focus of the question you're asking. So a couple of different things. First of all, it affected us to the point where we're about 90% teleworking right now for the organization. Surprisingly, we've been far more effective than I would have ever anticipated 2.5 months ago when this all started, because we weren't built as an organization with telework. We're just trying to build the organization. Turns out we've actually accomplished more in the last 2 months than I think accomplished in the previous 6 months, because everybody is so focused on the problems at hand. Now, the cost to them is they're on teleconference calls from 6 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, but it's amazing how much we're getting done. I was just telling somebody a couple of days ago that the level of sophistication and maturity that I'm seeing out of this organization and the missions is so admirable. It tells me momentum is just building to the point where it will be unstoppable over the course of the next year. But it has effective, no doubt about it. Now, we're not doing a lot at the classified level yet, although with joint warfighting, we're getting more into classified operations. So the good news is it didn't affect us much without having access to all the different classified systems. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is we had the most forward-leaning individuals say we cannot stand by and watch what's happening in the country and not offer our help as a JAIC. And what we did is stand up something called Project Salus. Salus is the Roman goddess of health, welfare, and safety, and well-being. And what we wanted to do is offer help in the terms of predictive analytics for sort of COVID-19 modeling, supply chain, supply demand risk analysis, and do real predictive analytics. That starts, as every AI project does, with figuring out what data you have and what you do with the data. So some organizations are jump right on the data problem, great aggregate data, but what's missing, especially for the department, is what we do to turn predictive using mostly machine learning. There's a strong NLP component to this as well. So they had to work with data curation, data munging. So we had to kind of corral the data. At this point, as I speak today, I think we're over 75 different sources of government, open source, and commercial data. Now, there are policy and legal reviews that have to happen with all that data. But just getting our arms around that took, like any AI project, and accelerated for COVID-19 about the first month. And then we had a variety of vendors, so forward-leaning, eager to work with the department. No one company, it's a variety of different companies, big to some of the smaller ones, helping us with, now that we have a platform to put all the data on, what can we do to come up with predictive analytics? And it's something like, so the commander of US Northcom or the National Guards, all say at the state level, wanting to make decisions about resource allocation in 2 days, 30 days, can we give them a sufficiently high probability determinations that allow them to make some of those decisions in advance? We have built over 40 models, very different stages of development. I will not claim victory on any of the 40. They're sort of all in MVP status or even sort of below that. But we're sharing those with our customer of United States Northern Command and the National Guard, and we're getting very good feedback. And we're focusing more than ever before, which is part of our mission in the JAIC as well, is user experience and user interface. Because, hey, it's great to give me a bunch of data, but I can't find where that stuff is. It happens in every single operation store any of us have ever been. Straight bunch of data out there. I don't know what to do with it. Look right. You're giving me cutting edge, putting on a legacy system. I'm using legacy workflows. None of that works the way it's supposed to. So what we're focusing on is helping those two commands, both National Guard and United States Northern Command. I'm really happy with that because the team just put so much effort into this. And the last thing I'll say about it is we did the integrated product team model. It's a microcosm of success for the rest of the JAIC. So at the same time, we're working with these companies on product development, to include helping us with the talent side, by the way. They're not just offering technology, they're offering talent. We're doing policy and legal reviews, looking at the ethics pieces. We're doing evaluation on the models as being developed. We're looking at how we integrate them in. We're looking at what does the platform need to look like. So this idea is small, but very agile and nimble. Great product team is the model for the JAIC. It's all of that put together rather than these silos, which is what happens too often sometimes in the rest of the department. Over.
Well, thank you, sir. Our next question comes from Zoe Stanley Lockman on the topic of allies and partners. So for our audience, one of the very first partnerships with the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center was with Singapore's Defense Science and Technology Agency to focus on tech collaboration on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So sir, we'd love to hear a little bit about lessons learned that we can offer to our allies and partners, and how can we work collaboratively with them on artificial intelligence moving forward?
Yeah, so it's a really good question and something we're intently focused on in the JAIC. The challenge we had in Project Maven is we never had the capacity, the number of people to do more than start with Five Eyes, because our closest partnerships on the intel side of this. But even there, even though the data was unclassified, the challenges of sharing data on systems that were not commonly accessed, was more frustrating than I ever hoped it would be, to the point where I think they're just now beginning to have breakthroughs about how do we share data with each other, unclassified data, never mind models, which bring in potential questions of foreign military sales and some of the other sort of esoteric components of doing business with partners and allies in the Pentagon. But so it could only do so much on the Intel side. On the JAIC side, I have a whole team focused on international engagement. I think I said it earlier, over 70 different engagements. Now we're trying to prioritize, and they're not going to be so-called traditional countries all the time. You look at who's moving probably the fastest in some of these areas. It's Singapore, it's Israel, it's some of the Baltic countries, some parts of NATO, UK, France, Germany. So some are traditional or some are a little less so. We're trying to figure out what those partnerships should look like. Netherlands, for instance, we have a terrific relationship, and I expect we'll have a liaison come from the Netherlands before the year is out. But what we did at the beginning is a simple, here is what the DoD AI strategy is. You have some equipment. If so, can we talk about partnership opportunity? Turns out frustrating it is to me, day in, day out, should be moving faster, far in front of everybody else right now in terms of AI. Everybody's struggling the same way we struggle in building this up. Nobody has the capacity that we've built in the JAIC, which is, as of Monday, was 185 people, to include the government part as well as contractors. Will be over 300 a little over a year from now. That brings me critical mass. With critical mass, I can focus on these international partnerships. I mentioned earlier, I think I did, that I went out and sat down with NATO. So I had an at 29 session with every representative from 29 nations talking about AI. It was a little bit eye-opening for a lot of people. First of all, some people made assumptions about what DoD was doing that involved sort of autonomous weapon systems. I assuaged them that that was not the case. Here's what we're working on, predictive maintenance, and we found opportunities that have not yet been implemented yet on things like, can we work together on predictive maintenance, or HADR? Everybody's sort of interested in those lower consequence, lower threat use cases for NATO. I had a session with the European Union, turned out far better than I actually thought it would be. Why? Because we're all concerned about the same sort of AI ethics principles. If you use that as a starting point, we find common ground right off the bat. With Singapore, we're looking at a relationship on the HADR project. Singapore is moving, as Singapore likes to do, very quickly in this space. They're a very tech-oriented nation, and they want to partner with us. And so we're looking at how do we bring what these discussions have been into actual execution. So we found opportunities. Now what we need to do next is take those conversations and turn them into concrete action plans. And it's not just us offering something to somebody else. There are countries that we would love to get their tech in the door. It's some of the most best tech I've seen out there on AI. Are there opportunities for us to get it from our allies and partners and share it back once we've done, sort of repurposed it for sort of DoD needs with DoD data? So there's a data component of this that we have to work our way through. There's an architecture part that we have to work our way through. Can we access each other's architecture? And then there's sort of this policy aspect driven by policy considerations, which is OSD policy, but it's also State Department. They're not simple issues. These are big things that we have to work through. But there's a third global to be moving forward. I think saw an idea by Michael Kraskowitz, Chief Technology Officer of the White House, global partnership on the G7. Love it. It's just a big announcement that we're going to work together in the G7 to advance a common cause and sort of these common value systems, not the illiberalism approach that China is taking to their employment of AI. So it's very positive momentum on the international front, have a lot of work to do.
Great. So I think maybe what we'll do here is pair two questions together, right? Sort of flip sides of each other. The first one from Frank Gorank from FG2 Solutions asks, what JAIC accomplishment are you most proud of? And then second, the aforementioned Mike Kanan of Air Force and up at MIT asks, if you could snap your fingers and have one thing fixed or changed right now, what would it be?
Have him come back and work for us in the JAIC. All right, so that's the flip answer. Now, the more honest answer is Mike's a superstar. He knows kind of where this needs to go. But the problem is there is no finger snapping that's going to solve anything in the department. It's a decade journey that we have to go through. Why do I say that? The culture aspects. I can't change culture overnight. It never changes overnight. It takes years, and it takes a successive parade of leaders at the highest level, because the innovation's happening from the bottom. It's there. I know it's there. Mike knows there. Mike's been writing about this. Mike just came out with a book himself on this. It's very well respected in this space. But at the same time, that by itself doesn't get it done. You need that senior leadership support and advocacy. And that's going to take a while to build in. And then to show results and prove the return on investment is worth, putting the money in that we're putting into it. So I wish I could snap my fingers and say the department gets it, and we just have fixed AI for the DoD. I think it's 5 to 10 years when we can say it's beginning to be just inculcated into the fabric of the department, and it becomes like electricity. There is no Department of Electricity. Maybe at some point in the future, there doesn't need to be a joint artificial intelligence center. We're a long way from that right now. So I wish I could snap my fingers, but a combination of the data problem, the culture problem, the talent problem, and people who understand what product management really is like. So I would say, maybe if there was one thing that I point to and say we can fix this, it's give us more freedom to operate and take risk, that we don't have the necessary level of detail on budget data, because I don't know what the tech looks like 6 months from now. I cannot begin to know what a year. The technology from the beginning of Maven today, it's gone. It's tenfold improvement in some of the capabilities. What does that look like? I'm a proponent of the technology S curve, and we're on the flat part of that right now. I don't know exactly when we hit the inflection point and we go up the slope of that curve and it's exponential growth. It's coming. I'm a firm believer in repeating what somebody far smarter than me said once upon a time, and others have repeated it. We as a nation or as a world tend to have over expectations on technology in the short term, and we're under expectations over the longer term. We're going to hit that exponential curve point and really have exponential growth at some point. But the only way that happens, we have to build the foundational elements that we're focused on today. And that could be the Joint Common Foundation, fixing the data challenges we have, and so forth. But we will get there. What we can't do is give up on the JAIC right now. Because if we were to give up, then I think China gets that natural advantage. I don't like the term arms race. I'll never use the term arms race, but it's a strategic competition. We have to get AI right for our own purposes, for our own national security, for our own economic well-being, vitality. It will change jobs of the future for the nation. But even as we acknowledge that, we recognize what China's intent is, the resources they're putting against their side of the problem. So we can't afford to let up on the gas pedal one bit. If anything, I would say we have to go faster. Have to go faster and put more resources against it, knowing that not everything will deliver as advertised. I can never promise that it's all going to work out swimmingly, but $200 million a year as a down payment to begin to change the department seems reasonable to me. Now, we'll have to prove to a lot of boards of directors inside and outside the building that we're serious about getting this right. And to your other question, I think, which was what am I most proud of? Big Bang Theory. From nothing to what we have today as an organization, 18 months in fighting battles inside the because there's not yet some organization from the start in the garage in June 2018, where bass drummer and keyboard and lead artist to 180 people a day and continuing to grow from no money to a budget of over $1.3 billion across the FIDO. That's real growth, right? And it's serious. This is no longer a startup. This is no longer an insurgency. We have to change the department in systematic ways, or we should be shut down. We're going to be held accountable for delivery. Just hold me accountable for delivery, for less of sort of the other aspects of metrics that sometimes people like to track. We have to deliver, but this has the potential to change the Department of Defense. Let's give it some time. So I'm very proud of running Project Maven from the beginning when I was a complete and utter neophyte, and I'm barely beyond that stage now, but still understand enough to understand what that potential looks like and where we could be in 5 years. So I'm very proud of getting the momentum to this point where somebody far more talented than me is going to take over acting director, because he understands the tech business better than I ever could hope to understand. Over.
Fantastic, sir. I think we maybe have time for one more question, maybe two. Lindsay, do you have anything?
Yes, sir. I think this would be, a great time, reflecting on all of the great nuggets of wisdom that you've given us in the conversation we've had so far. So for everybody looking into the Department of Defense and into the JAIC from the outside, what should they be looking for in the next few years to know that we're getting the job done and that we're getting it done well? What are those indicators that you'll be watching for as you hand over the reins to your successor?
We have to deliver. Simple as that. My boss, Dana Deasy, is the Chief Information Officer of the department, constantly hits me up saying 2020 is the year of delivery. So the next year, 2020 to 2021, should be a breakout year for the department. We have to deliver. And when I say deliver, it means delivering to a point where a combatant commander, himself or herself, is willing to come to the deputy, the vice chairman, the chairman, and the secretary and said, I need the JAIC. The JAIC is doing enough for me that I can't afford not to have what they offer. And equally on the services side of this, I need to give them incentive to have conversations with the we need to live for them. Give me enough time to show that I can work on the culture with them and not competition. The last thing I ever want the JAIC be viewed as a self-licking ice cream cone that's doing its own thing because it's built this big bureaucracy all for its own purposes. I have to be nimble. I always didn't want to grow too big for this very reason. Too big is too bad. Just big enough, which seems to be 300-ish for sort of the outside analogies in different companies. But I've got to show that we're helping the services with their problem sets. Everything we do in the JAIC, from strategy and policy to test and evaluation, from ethics to the Joint Common Foundation, should be built as packaged products that we turn over to somebody else to help them accelerate their own programs. It's a business model of leverage. We can't change the department all by itself. Everything we do should be a packaged product that helps somebody else scale their internal programs. And we move more and more from being a products organization to a services organization once we've built enough products for everybody to understand what it takes to sort of get momentum going on AI. So that, to me, that's what it's about, delivery. First and foremost, we have to deliver for the rest of the Department of Defense.
Well, sir, that takes us just about to time here. If there's any other parting shots, you mentioned, I think maybe next week or the week after will actually be the end of a 36-year run in the U.S. Air Force. Any final thoughts to share with our audience today?
I lost the video, but I don't know if I've lost you, but I'll just say that how much of an honor it has been to serve the country for 36 years in things I never could have predicted as a second lieutenant in 1984 coming out of the University of Michigan. All I wanted to do was fly for a little while, and turns out I stood up 2 AI fielding organizations in the Department of Defense. So I'm honored and proud to have that opportunity, and hope that whoever behind me can even do much better and do it faster than I ever could have hoped for. So proud of the opportunity, and I don't know if I'm still on the audio or not, but I just wanted to say thank you to both of you, Lindsay and Brian, for coming up this morning with me and having this conversation. And I'm just couldn't be happier walking out the door at this point, knowing that the JAIC's on a path for, as I say, resounding success. So thank you.
Well, sir, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and congratulations on a truly innovative, fantastic career in the U.S. military. To everyone who joined us today, thank you so much for sharing your morning with us. The video of this conversation will reside on our CSIS YouTube channel and on our CSIS event page. So feel free to watch again or flag for interested friends and colleagues. And with that, again, we'll sign off. Thank you so much.